Hello quilters, and it's time for us to make our third block in the sampler quilt series. And that block is called Crossing the Circles. And as you can see, the block is by Jennifer Dick of 42 Quilts. And you're getting a good look at the block now, and you can also see that you will need a variety of fabrics. You can see that each one of the little units has a different background. Then it has a different circle. And in this sample or in this photograph, you see that two colors were used for the crosses. In two of the units, the crosses are black, and in two of the units, the crosses are gray. Since I'm using African fabrics and two other solids, mine will be a little different. Yours could very well be a little different also. So collect your fabrics, get your ideas together, select all of your tools, and we will be ready to go. Now, in case you can't see this, you need 4 squares, and those can be of assorted colors. You need 4 4.5-inch circles. You need a medium gray, that's the gray in the cross. You need a medium gray solid. You need a dark gray solid. And then I'm adding a lightweight fusible interfacing. And I will tell you in a minute why that has been added. And let's talk about the circles first. Now, the pattern calls for you to cut out a 4.5-inch circle for each of the units. And you can see that here. There are little circles. Well, this pattern tells you to needle turn applique those circles onto the background fabric. I don't do that, and I want to share with you the way that I get circles ready to be appliqued, because I think it's a little bit better than dealing with that raw edge and turning it under. However, if you're very good at doing that, by all means, do what works best for you. But I saw a technique on Sewing with Nancy many years ago, and I have used that technique over and over again. And so the reason the one thing that has been added to the supplies that Jennifer didn't add, and that's a lightweight fusible interfacing, is because that's how I prepare my circles, so that when I get them all ready to go onto the background fabric, I don't worry about any raw edges, and I'll show that technique to you momentarily. When you get ready to cut the circles out, you could use a circle cutter. This is designed for cutting circles out of fabric. If you have one, great. If you don't have one, look around your house. You may have the top to a bottle or a jar that has a 4-inch diameter. A 4.5-inch diameter. You can use that. Or go through your kids' old school supplies or your own old school supplies. Find a compass, set the measurement for 2.5, draw your circle, cut it out. That's what I did to get this circle. And you can use a lightweight cardboard, nothing fancy, because you're just going to trace around it. Or you could use an old folder, or if you have it, you can use Quilter's template plastic. Either of these will work. You just need that circle so that you can trace around it to get the circles for each of the units in this block. Now, when you cut your circles out, I like to, let me move this out of the way. I have my lightweight interfacing, and I have the fusible side turned up. The fusible side is turned up, keep that in mind. Then I lay my fashion fabric on it, or the fabric that I'm using to make the circles. That's all too small. So if I were going to cut the circles from this blue grunge, I would lay the blue grunge face the right side down. So keep in mind, with the fusible side is up. With the fabric, the right side is down, so that the fusible and the right side are laying together. Then you will cut your circle, trace around this. And it's always great to cut them at the same time. And they're all ready for you to go to the next step. But you would trace around this, get your scissors or your rotary cutter, and cut that circle out. And when you do, you will have this. Here are my circles. There's the fashion fabric or the circle fabric, and the interfacing is behind it. That's one. I'm sorry. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to do this again just to make sure you've got it. I don't want to confuse you. Right side of the circle fabric. Fusible side of the interfacing goes down on the right side. Okay, once again, right side of the circle fabric. Fusible interfacing goes down on the right side of the circle fabric. And that's what you're going to do for all 4 of your circles. Then, to get rid of all of the raw edges, once we get all 4 of those circles laying just like this, we're going to take them to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch all the way around, so that we encase that whole raw edge. You don't have to leave a space to turn it. Just stitch 1/4 of an inch all the way around, stitching that interfacing to the circle fabric. And you will do that for all 4 circles. Here are our circles. Got kind of a mess here. I've sewn the circles, and you can see there's the circle fabric. There is the lightweight fusible webbing, lightweight fusible. And now that I've sewn it all the way around, I want to show you what you do to prepare it to go into your quilt. And the first thing I like to do, I do this on all circular seams, is clip into the seam allowance. So I'm just going to clip toward the stitching, and you will be able to see this in a minute. And these clips are about 1/2 of an inch apart. They don't have to be a lot. They don't have to be very close to each other, but you do want to clip not quite to the seam line, but out in the seam allowance. And like I said, they're approximately 1/2 inch apart. Because when you clip this, it makes that seam allowance behave when you get ready to turn this right side out. And you get rid of some of the bulk, and pieces of the seam allowance will lay flat against each other when you have these little clips in there. The next thing that I like to do to this, you can see the clips. And the next thing I'm going to do to the seam allowance is trim some of it away. I trim about 1/8 of it away, making sure I don't trim into the seam. I don't want to do that. That means starting all over again with another piece of fabric and another piece of fusible. And I don't want to do that. So I just take my time. And even when you're sewing these together, especially if this technique is new to you, take your time. There is no reason to rush. Sometimes sewing circular seams can be tedious. So don't feel as if you have to hurry and go as fast as you can. Just slow down and go around the curve as slowly as you can to maintain your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so now I have clipped and I have trimmed, and now I'm going to turn this right side out. So the first thing I want to do is separate the two layers. Here is the circle fabric down here, the fusible here. And I'm just going to make a little slit in the fusible. Now that I've done that, I can go in and begin to cut away some of the fusible. And I usually trim this down to about 3/4 of an inch. So here we go. I don't want to take all of it out, but I don't need all of it either. And so this is a happy medium. You just take out just enough so that you can turn a nice seam. And now all of your raw edges on the circle are finished, and you don't have to worry about needle turn applique. In fact, I am going to applique these with my sewing machine. So let's get turning. And I find that I can smooth that seam out with my fingers. I have a little tool that will help me with that too, but if you take your time and smooth it with your fingers as you're turning it, the seam will lay just where you want it to be, and then just kind of pinch it. Make sure you don't put an iron on it yet because you've got fusible in there and it's not yet time to put any heat on it. So we keep turning, we keep running our finger along the seam line and pinching, and we get this turned right side out, and you have your circle edges all finished, and you don't have to worry about needle turn applique, and there's your circle. And now I'll take these to the ironing board, and I'm going to press right along this seam. And of course, that fusible will fuse with the circle fabric. So once I get that done, we will be ready to start putting our units together. Here are our 4 circles. They've all been pressed, and they're ready now for me to attach to our background fabric. And you've been with me since the introduction. You know that I am using some of my African fabrics. So let's lay these out and see what we have. These are 4 of the African fabrics that I'm using, and I want to put circle here, circle here, circle here, and a circle here. Now, one of the things that our directions will tell us is to eyeball the center. If these are a little off-centered, that is not going to matter. So don't stress over folding the background fabric one way and then folding it another to get the exact center. You don't need to do that. You just need to eyeball where you're going to put your circles. That's all. And if you notice in the picture, the circles are off-centered a little bit. You can see that this circle is not in the center, nor is this one, or this one. So don't stress over putting the circles in the center of that background fabric. Just lay the circle down, give it a home, and get ready to affix it to the background fabric. And as I mentioned earlier, in my case, I am going to stitch mine down. I just would rather do that than try to get them on by hand. If you are a quilter who is very good at needle turn applique, then by all means use that to affix your circles. Or you may have a technique better than what I have, or one with which you are more familiar. Feel free to use your method for attaching your circles, and your method will be just fine. So what I need to do now is get these to the sewing machine, get them sewn, and then let you see what they look like. Here are our 4 units. Circles have been attached. I just used a straight stitch to attach them. I elongated that stitch. I made it a 4.0 stitch, made it a little bit longer than it would have been ordinarily. Now, I will say to you, this is a good place to use a zigzag stitch. You may have a variety of overcast stitches on your sewing machine. Try 1 or 2 of those in this place. This is a good place to use some of those stitches that come on our sewing machine, but we rarely ever get to use them. Overcasting on these would be great, especially now since you have finished the edges. You don't have to worry about maybe not catching a certain edge because there are no raw edges on our circles and there are no edges to worry about fraying or coming apart. So let your imagination fly, and you could easily do a different decorative stitch on each unit in the block. That would be attractive. Or you may use a different color thread. Perhaps you would like to use a metallic thread and one of your decorative stitches. Anything would work. The sky is the limit. You're only limited by your own imagination. And in this case, I didn't use much imagination. I just got my circle sewn on, but I want you to feel free to just go for it and have a good time of fixing the circles onto the fabric. So now our directions tell us how to put the crossbars into the units. And we're going to cut our fabric. Originally, the directions told us that we needed some rectangles that were 1 inch by 6.5 inches long. And I tried to do that when I worked with this pattern a little earlier before trying to show you how to do it. And it seemed to me that once I cut this and sewed a rectangle into this, it was going to make the unit longer or wider. So I changed those directions just a little bit. For each set of crossbars that I need, I cut 1 rectangle 6.5 inches and 1 rectangle is 7 inches. Because once you put this in once you cut this apart and sew one of these rectangles in, that unit is going to be a little bit larger. So you need a second rectangle that's going to make up for the space you're adding to the unit. Okay, so I need to show you where I plan to put my crossbars. The first thing it tells you to do is to cut this unit 2 3/4 from the left edge. Here's the left edge. I have to cut 2 3/4 here. Here's the left edge. I have to cut 2 3/4. There's the left edge. I have to cut 2 3/4 in. And on this left edge, 2 3/4. Doesn't matter where the circle is. Doesn't matter how much of the circle you cut through. Just use that measurement of 2 3/4 and cut along that measurement. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, I remember early in my quilting career, many years ago, I was working on a project and the block told me to cut the directions told me to cut that block after I had sewn it together. And I can remember how I felt. I really didn't want to cut into what I had just sewn. I was so afraid I was going to make a mistake and would have to start all over again. And if you're feeling that, don't worry about it. Number 1, it's just fabric, and number 2, you did it once, so you can do it again. Okay, so let's measure 2 3/4. Here it is, 1, 2, 3/4, and I want to line that up with the edge of the left edge of my unit. And now I'm going to cut. And I have My short, remember I told you my two rectangles are not the same length. One is a little longer than the other. I'm going to take the shorter one, and that's going to be sewn. One side of it will be sewn to this that I just cut away, and one side will be sewn into this side so that this now becomes part of the unit. And so we get that pinned on, and I'm going to leave it right there until I cut all of the units so I can take all of them to the sewing machine at the same time. And once again, it's a 2 3/4 cut, 2 3/4 inch cut. So here's my 2 3/4 line. And I think one of the reasons that this is such an attractive block is because that circle does not have to be centered. It's more like what happens in nature. You know, nature isn't always perfect. Notice up here when I cut, I have quite a bit of the circle over there. But this time when I cut, I'm not going to have quite as much circle, which is going to be fine, absolutely fine. And here are my two rectangles that I want to use there. So they're two different lengths, so I'm going to take the shorter one. And the shorter one is what will be sewn here. And so I can pin that. So this one is ready to go to the sewing machine. And here's the next one. Kind of have to figure out how I want this blue fabric. I think I want the blue fabric turned in that direction. So I'm going to measure 2 3/4. Wow, I have a lot of the circle under the ruler this time. And this is the fabric that will go in there. So I'll use the shorter of the two. That's the 6 1/2 inch one. And I can stack that. And here's the last one. And I'm going to measure 2 3/4. Almost cutting down the middle of the circle. So all four of them are different. I just love it. That's another thing about quilting that just gets me going is the serendipity effect of quilting. You think you know what you're going to get, and then when you actually do it, you get something you never ever expected. So here they are. They're all ready to be sewn. I'll take them to the sewing machine, get them sewn, and then show them to you. Okay, I've sewn these, and now you can see what they look like with the first rectangle inserted in. And when you do this, make sure you press your seam allowances. And in my case, I press both seam allowances toward the insert. This is one, and here's the other one. And the insert is small. Once it's sewn, it's 1/2 inch wide. I love this little detail here. You never quite know how the fabric's going to act, but I love that little black part that cuts right across the circle. And so you can see these. Now, when you line them up this way, you want to line them up so that the ends of the crosses don't match. You see right here? These don't match. These don't match. They don't run into each other. And that's what you want. So play with these a little bit and make sure you don't get a matchy-matchy situation here. Notice this one and this one do not match. They don't come into each other. Nor does that happen here. Now we're almost done, but we're not quite there. The next thing we have to do is cut the block, cut the unit again. But this time we're going to cut it 2 3/4 inches from the top. So I'm going to get my ruler, measure 2 3/4 inches down, and cut across. And keep in mind that whatever the top is of the unit is your decision. You play around with them a little bit. You decide this is the top of my unit, this is the bottom of my unit. Or you decide this is the top, but I didn't want that to be the top. See what happened? These two inserts run into each other. So I definitely didn't want that to happen. I'd rather have it this way. But you can play around with it. I think one of the reasons I like this block and so many blocks in this book is they lend themselves to so much of our own creativity. We can take what someone else has designed and then just make it ours in so many different ways. So I'm going to now cut this 2 3/4 inches from the top. Get my trusty little ruler here, and I've got 1, 2, 3/4, and you can see that that's on the 2 3/4 line. No, you can't see that. Let's put it up here, and I'm measuring 2 3/4, and I want a nice straight cut. And this is where the second insert will go. That's one. And this is also why I made my second insert a little bit longer, so that it would be enough to compensate for the extra 1/2 inch that has been added to the background fabric and the circle. Once you get these cut and sewn, you can turn them around, play with them. What you thought was going to be the top at first is now the bottom or the side. And what you can just turn it in whatever ways work best for you so that you get the look that you want. I think quilt block designers expect that from us. Okay, so here are my second inserts, and I can go to the sewing machine and put those in and show you what the units look like. Now, quilters, here are our 4 units laid out on the table. The cross has been added, both parts of the cross, and after all, the block is called Crossing the Circles. And I have turned the blocks because I want to make sure I don't have any of these points intersecting. I want all of them to be slightly away from each other, just as you see here. There are no crosses touching each other from unit to unit. Now it's just a matter of sewing this unit to this one, sewing this unit to this one, and then sewing one long seam. I do want to point out one little thing before I do that. I want you to see how the seam allowances have been pressed. All seam allowances for the inserts have been pressed toward the inserts. And I think it makes for a neater stitching, and it will also reduce bulk when you get ready to quilt this. So I hope you will keep that in mind when you get ready to sew it. One other little tidbit, when you sew that last insert in, remember you have to match the 2 halves of the first inset. So be very careful about that, so that when you finish the unit, it really is a cross. You don't want this to be up here and this to be down there. So you want to make sure you match those when you're stitching. And if you look on the back of the little unit here, you can see where those stitches are that show that that does match. And I want you to be careful about that. There are not a lot of things you have to be careful about when you're working on this block, but that's one of the things you want to look at and be very aware of. You want the viewer's eye to see a cross going across the circle. If the pattern were such, and you may adjust it this way, where it's just some lines in the circle, you wouldn't have to worry so much or be quite as focused on making those two sides match. But in our case, they should match. All right, let me get these sewn and I'll show you the final block. Here is our finished block. Let me get some of the things out of the way so you can appreciate what happened with our African fabrics and our neutrals to help the African fabrics really shine. Once you get to this point, you want to make sure that you're not having any matches here when you sew this seam together. No matches here, no matches, no matches. And when you sew this, you want to make sure that when you press this seam allowance, press it in one direction, and then press this seam allowance in the opposite direction so that the seam allowances nestle here in the middle and you reduce the bulk. Then you're going to sew this seam and you have your completed block. Now those of you that were with me in the sampler introduction, you know that I told you I am going to make 15 blocks and I am going to make 2 of each because I like a big quilt. So 30 blocks, 30 12.5-inch blocks makes the kind of quilt that I like. So this is the one we just did, and here is the other block done with the same pattern. And it's a little bit lighter. This one has far more drama because I used more of the African fabrics, and the African fabrics are in the background on this one. And so we see a lot more drama here than we do here. Same pattern, and that's something that you can think about as you consider making this block. Do you want a lot of drama in the block? If so, use fabrics that will give you that drama. Do you want your block to be a little more subdued? If so, use fabrics that will give you that. Either way, you are able to put you into this block. Jennifer gave us the block. Now it's up to us to put it together in a way that is truly pleasing to us. And before we move away, I want to say a little something about our circle cutting tool. There are several tools on the market for cutting circles out of fabric. I've tried some of them, not all of them, and I have found that this one was the best, and I'll tell you why. It's a very safe tool to use. The blade that actually does the cutting is in this housing, so that when you're using it, and if you're using it properly, you're not going to cut yourself. The point, that you pivot around, is in this housing. So it does not engage until you press down on it. So you are safe using this. I have seen some cutting tools where some of my students got cut because the tool wasn't safe. If you want a tool for cutting circles, and I am by no means a person to do a commercial, but I have found this to be very accurate and very safe. And you can see that there are measurements on both sides for me to measure the diameter that I want to cut for my circle, and I just love it. So if you're in the market for one, this is the True Cut. I would suggest getting this if you have a lot of fabric circles to cut. You do have some here, but you could even, as I said earlier, just make a cardboard template and cut your circles from this. enjoy this block. I'm going to bring that set of directions for what you need up close. Remember, you're going to see fusible interfacing on there. That's because of the way I like to treat circles. If that is not the way that you want to treat your circles, by all means, you do what works for you. And just leave the fusible, lightweight interfacing out of your supplies. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next block, Block 4.